be able to tell it's really rolling that well. Okay, so let's go ahead and go over these controls. So on this ball rig, we have our main control right here. They call it the master control. And so this one's going to be moving it around in space. And it's also going to be rotating our ball, right? One thing I also want to keep kind of call to y'all's attention is it's really important when we're doing this that we're knowing how to switch back and forth between local and world space orientation. And you guys have probably, I'm hoping at this point you guys have done it before a couple times, but I'm going to go ahead and open up my, oh my God. Let's just go to single plane. Okay. I'm going to open up my tool settings. And so you can change it here where I can, if I, let's go ahead and rotate this bad boy for a second. So I'll rotate it, right? And so right now mine's on object orientation, which means that it has a local Y up, a local Z forward, and a local X right and left. And if I go to world, right, it's going to use that world orientation instead. So it's a good idea to probably work most of the time in object orientation mode. So you just access it from your tool settings by double clicking on your tool, whether it's your move, rotate, or scale. You can also hold the hotkey for that tool, so W, E, or R. If you hold W, and while you're holding W, you left click and hold, you can quickly switch between world and object. I'm sure I've covered it before, but I just wanted to reiterate it. So this is a good way that you can swap between object and world orientation without having to go into your tool settings. Okay, I'm going to close that. All right, I'm going to set this back to 0. So that's our move tool. So it's mostly just going to be for for translating our character through space. We have these two controls on top and bottom, right? So these are our squash and stretch controls, right? And so it's just going to control our squashing and stretching from the top or bottom pivot, right? If you ever do a bouncing ball exercise, they're almost always going to guarantee to have a squash and stretch. The reason why I like this one is because normally with a lot of the other ones that are popular is you can't squash and stretch and rotate, right? So like they're not independent of each other, right? So this one means I can rotate the ball, but the squash and stretch is not going to be changing with it, right? A lot of them, what they'll do is if you rotate the ball, it has to squash and stretch in that same direction the ball is rotated. That's one of the reasons why I'm like doing this one. What's kind of cool about this one is, let's go ahead and squash this down a little bit. It also has like an orientation for the squash and stretch, right? So I can actually rotate that squash and stretch so it's squashing and stretching in a different direction. So if you have like the ball hit a wall or something like that, right? Like let's say I'm going to have it smack into a wall. I can have it squash and stretch like that, which is pretty cool. I'll grab all these controls and I'm just going to go ahead and zero them out. Okay. And so that's the basics of this. Kind of like what we did with the little cube walking guy. We put the geometry into a layer, and so you can see I'm not able to select the layer. I could if I want to by just turning off the reference mode on that layer. I'm just going to keep it onto reference mode, which is R. Okay. So before we get into doing the main animation stuff, we're going to be changing a couple things or double checking some settings. I'm going to come down over here to the bottom right. On my version of Maya, it changes, so I'm not sure if 2020 is different off the top of my head. Probably is. It might not be, actually, but there's a little running man with a gear icon, or we can go over to Windows, settings and preferences, we're going to come down to, actually, I always forget which one it's under, so I actually use this time slider. Okay, thank you, time slider. This is just a shortcut. So if you go to your preferences and you go down to time slider, or you click on little running man, we're going to have our animation playback settings. And we did this with the camera stuff a little bit, I think in one of my recorded videos on setting keyframes and animation. But I just want to kind of go over this again. We're working in 24 frames per second. This is pretty common for animation and film, is 24 frames per second. It's kind of like a cinematic look. And so we're typically, when we're doing short films or creating animation for movies or something like that, or going to release like a video on YouTube or Vimeo or something like that, a lot of times we'll work in 24 frames per second. So as a reminder, frame rate is how many images are being displayed per second of time, real world time. So in this case, we're showing 24 images per second of real world time. So when I say 1 Mississippi, 24 images passed, right? For something like a video game, I might be working with a different frame rate, right? Because a lot of times video games and other medium, like interactive medium, they want to display images quicker or more images per time, right? So they might be working with like 30 or even 60 frames per second, right? And so that means more images go by in that same amount of time. So in this case, it's almost more than twice as many images are shown. And the reason why that is for interactive and games is that it kind of, well, for games, it feels a little bit more fluid, right? Because you're trying to like track action better and your actions have consequences. So you want to see things more in detail. And then something like if you're using like VR headset on, right, it can help with alleviating like motion sickness and other issues where if you have a choppy frame rate or a lower frame rate, it's going to feel kind of stuttered. And, you know, we're not used to seeing reality in like fewer frames. And so you get a little nauseous. But we have this precedent of 24 frames per second for films, and it has like a cinematic quality. I don't know if you guys have ever had like a new TV or seen a new TV and it has like the sports mode or something on it. What it's doing is the refresh rate is faster on those and everything feels like a little off, right? It feels like you can be watching a TV show that you normally watch, but all of a sudden it feels like it's like a soap opera or something like that. It feels like kind of low budget. And that's because that refresh rate is showing you more images than you're normally used to looking at with film, like, you know, film and cinematography, right? So this is just kind of like a look that has been developed over time. So we just really want to change that frame rate and set it to maybe 24 frames per second. Playback speed, they change this between versions where it'll say like full speed, half speed, twice the speed or something like that. In my version, it's ×1 times 0.5 times 2. So you don't want this to be at play every frame. You want this to be 24 frames per second. Play every frame, I mentioned this in the animation video, but play every frame, what that's going to do is it's going to make it so that when you do, it's going to play each frame of your animation in Maya as fast as it can. So normally with 24 frames per second, what it's going to do is it's going to do whatever it takes to make sure that you're seeing your animation at 24 frames per second. If your scene is really heavy and you're working on a really crummy laptop, or maybe you have a decent laptop, but you're just seeing so big, what that means is Maya is like, okay, I can't process these images fast enough. I'm going to skip some because I need to make sure I'm showing the right frame number at this time, right? So in that case, sometimes what you'll want to do is you want to play every frame if your file is really heavy and really slow, because you want to see all the different frames in between to kind of understand if the action looks good. So in that case, you do want to switch to play every frame. If it's like dropping, if you do 24 frames per second, you're not seeing like any of your animation because it's just skipping so many frames. But most of the time, you just want to do 24 frames per second. And yeah, that's pretty much it. We could do, you can change update view to all or active, but that, again, that's a performance issue. It depends on how fast your computer is. So if you have multiple view windows, if you do active, it's only going to show updates in one view while you're playing. Okay. All right, and you can click save, don't click cancel like I did. We're going to be using, if you come up to workspace, I just like to go ahead and use the animation one. So we'll go ahead and click on workspace, and we're going to go down to animation. And it's going to go ahead and set us up for working with animation really well. It's going to highlight the animation shelf. It's going to show our channel box. It's going to show our perspective viewport. And it's also going to show this graph editor, which we haven't talked about before, and we're not going to talk about it just yet. So I'm going to scale this down. That's also going to give us all of our playback stuff right here. Oh, okay. For some reason, I thought I had 60 frames per second. Let me get this zoom control bar out of the way because it's going to be really annoying. Oh, one thing I like to do as well is what I don't like about this is I lose the help line. And when I'm learning things, I like to have the help line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to Windows. We're going to go to UI elements, and we're going to turn on the help line. So any of those, like the playback bar, the time slider right here, you can find all that's under Windows UI elements. So if you ever lose it, you can find it in here. Let's turn on the help line. And that's where we get that little message down here whenever I hover over something. So if you're ever confused about something, you can always hover over it, and it's going to tell you down here with the help line. Okay. So we're going to come back down to here in a second. Actually, you know, if I want to, I can just go back to Maya Classic for a second, just to get rid of that, the graph editor for a time being. So just as a recap, we have our time slider here, which is these numbers are going to correspond to the frames of our film. So remember, time in our short or in animation is based on frames, images, right? It's not based necessarily on seconds. It is, but it's based on how many frames you want to show per second. So I have the first frame, second frame, third frame, etc. If I go up to frame 24, or I guess technically 25, because it starts at 1, that's 24 frames. So that's 1 full second of time, right? From this frame to this frame, right? And so it's breaking up time into these frames, okay? So I can click and drag in here. Down here is going to be my time range. So the outside numbers, so you'll see there's 2 numbers on the left, 2 numbers on the right. The outside numbers are the minimum and maximum of your current scene, right? So if you want to have your animation in the shot take 200 frames, right? We have this 200 frames here. And then these numbers on the inside boxes are what we're currently looking at. So even though I might have an animation that goes from 1 to 200, sometimes I want to kind of like zoom in. So I can kind of click and drag on this little slider thing so I can zoom in on a part of my animation. So I'm just zooming in on the part that's from frames 1 to 9, right? So these interior numbers are essentially just like cropping or zooming in on your animation in terms of time. We don't have to worry about this stuff over here. The play buttons right here, we do want to worry about. So these play buttons are essentially just, you know, as you would expect, and you can hover over them. So you can play the animation forward at the right speed. So if I play it, you'll see it's going to go through 24 frames per second, right? And stop. I can click on this to go back to the beginning, click on this button to go to the end. And these other ones are going to be like stepping through frames and stuff like that, which you probably won't use that often. But maybe once you guys get more experience. Let's go ahead and start doing some keyframes. So I'm going to go ahead and switch so I'll switch back to Maya Classic. I'm going to switch over to the animation tab. And before I worry about my character, it's going to open the outliner. So I'll just click on the outliner button, or I'll click on this little button right here to open the outliner. I'm just going to hide this for just a second. And we're just going to practice for a second on a ball without a rig. And the reason why I'm doing this is because it's easy to duplicate. So I'm going to go ahead and create a ball. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it. So edit, duplicate. And I'll move it up here. And I just want to show you guys some stuff. So we're going to work with this first ball. So in order to set a keyframe, remember we're working in animation as pose to pose. And let's go ahead. I don't want this to be 200 frames. I'm just going to set this to something like 70 frames. So my whole animation is eventually, when I go back and do my animation, it's going to be 70 frames. But we'll worry about that in a second. And let me turn on my anti-aliasing. There we go. All right. So in order to set, we're working with post. The zoom thing is always going to be annoying. Okay. So I think, okay. So when we work with animation in 3D, we're working pose to pose, which means that we are setting key moments in our animation, and we let Maya figure out what it does in between, right? So at frame 1, let's say I want to set a pose. So you can do that with what's called a keyframe or a key. So I'm going to come up here to the key tab, and I'm just going to click on set key. You'll see my channel box highlights red, which means that there's a pose saved to that at that moment in time, right, to that object. So it has a pose saved here. And if I move forward, it has a light pink, which means there's no pose on that frame, but there is a pose somewhere on the time slider for that object. So it does have some animation to it, just not in that current frame. And let's say we're going to move forward to, let's see, 25, 49. Let's do 49. I just want it to be 2 seconds long. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and move it over here and then move it up and maybe even rotate it. And then I'm going to press S. Oh, sorry. I should not do that. I'll come over here and set key. You'll see there's a hotkey called that says S on it for snake, or set, I guess is probably more accurate. And so when you click on that, that's a hotkey, and you'll see I'm going to do it a lot more frequently. I'll just press S on my keyboard to set a keyframe. And so now you'll see I set 2 poses that are 2 seconds apart, right, or 49 frames. And you'll see Maya is automatically trying to figure out how to go from first pose to the second pose, right? So it's essentially going to look at those two poses and try to figure out what it's supposed to do to get to that second pose, right? And I'll go ahead and play that back, right? Okay. So that's the gist of keyframing. We can set keyframes on individual components, right? So let's say I want to scale this up right here, right? So I can just scale it up, and then I can right-click, select these scale values, right-click, and say key selected. So you can keyframe from the channel box, but you can also keyframe very specific attributes. You don't have to keyframe all of them. So you'll see there's no pose here for rotate, translate, and scale, right? I can move those and I can rotate them, but without keyframing them, it's not going to save that pose, right? But it did save that scale because I set a keyframe on it, right? And scales back, right? If I want to delete a keyframe, I just go in the time slider and I can right click on that frame and say delete. Okay. If I want to copy paste a keyframe, what I can do is I can right click and I can say copy, and I can go to another frame and paste it. And you'll see just copy paste that pretty easily. If I want to move it, what I can do is, this is slightly trickier, but you can hold shift to highlight or select something. And whenever you do that, it might be kind of small on my screen, but if I highlight, or if I'll drag this out, but you can see when you hold shift and you left click right here, you can actually drag out like a selection, kind of like if you were trying to select multiple files on your desktop, right? Anything any keyframes that are in here, let's say, so I'm going to say right here, I'll go ahead and scale this down, set a keyframe, and I'll go to here, scale that up, set a keyframe. Right, so this is some stupid looking animation. But I'll hold shift and left click and drag over these guys. And now that all three of them are selected, I can move them around, I can scale them. So if I click and drag in the middle, I can move them around and move them to a different location in time. I can scale them out, right? So I can drag on the endpoints and it's going to make them happen faster, right? So this happens over 2 frames, so it's going to be really quick. Or I can make them happen slower, so it's going to happen over a longer period of time. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And I can also delete all those keyframes by shift clicking and dragging, and then delete, and I got rid of all 3 of them. You can also, I think you can't, so you can't move them without doing a click drag over 1 keyframe. So you'll need at least 1 keyframe. Something that you need to keep in mind is don't use control copy, control paste, or anything like that, because those hotkeys don't work in here. And also any other Maya hotkeys you use up here aren't going to work on keyframes. So if you want to copy paste or duplicate frames and stuff like that, just remember that you can't use any of the hotkeys that you're used to up here. But I'll do it all the time. I always try to copy paste, and it always screws something up. It's not like irreversible screw up. It's more just like oh crap, I need to control Z something. All right, let me go ahead and I'm going to delete all these keyframes, and we are going to take a look at the graph editor. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to go up to frame 49. I'm going to move this object in the Z-axis, let's say 20. And it's going to be really far away. Maybe not 20. Let's do 10. Oh, it's going the opposite direction. Okay, sure. We'll rotate around to the side. All right, and I'll just go ahead and right click and say key selected. And I'll do the same thing on this guy. I'll go to frame, the same frame. I'm going to set this to 10. I'll right click, key selected, and I'll come over here to frame 1, set this to 0, and I'll right click and say key selected. I'm going to switch this to a different viewpoint. So I'm going to go to my panels. Actually, before we do that, let's go ahead and go to our animation layout. So I'll go to workspace, animation. We'll go ahead and click and drag this up a little bit so we can see the graph editor. And I'm going to switch my perspective view to one of my side or front views. So we'll do side view. Okay. And I'll scroll this out because I think this will be easier to visualize this. All right, so we'll go ahead and play this. Oh, it's going in the opposite direction. All right, we'll play it like this. And so this is going to stop at frame 49. So I'll go ahead and set my endpoint for here, 49, so we can play it back. Okay, so it's maybe, okay, sorry. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab both of these guys I'm gonna grab their end keyframe. We're just gonna make this happen faster because I think it's gonna be more obvious. It'll just happen over 1 second. We'll set this to 24 or 25. So it might be a little choppy on y'all's end, but if you guys set it up on your side, what's happening is these both have acceleration or deacceleration, and or also called ease in and ease out. What that means is it's going to speed up and slow down. And so what you're probably not aware of yet, if you haven't messed around with animation at all in a 3D package, is that Maya is doing some kind of interpolation. This is called interpolation, where Maya is trying to figure out for you how fast how things move, like we were saying, between one pose and another pose. It's called interpolation. So what I can do is I can select one of my objects, and you'll see we have down here this graph editor. And the graph editor is a graph showing the change over time. And this might be a little confusing for if you guys aren't used to this stuff, but what it does with my current selection, whatever object I have selected, it's going to show me different attributes, how it changes over time. So this is a really important component to learn for animation in Maya. So we're moving in Translate Z. Right now it's showing all of them, all of the different components, but nothing else is really being animated. So you're not really seeing anything else move except for Translate Z. Then we can isolate any of our animations or any of our attributes animations by just clicking on that component. Let's see. Let's go ahead and I'll go to this frame. I'll just press S on my keyboard to set a keyframe for everything because we were only setting a keyframe for Translate Z. So not everything had a animation to it. So you can see on most of these attributes. Okay, let me take a step back. So this is a graph, right, where the x-axis is always time, right? So you'll see when I click on drag on it, it's moving through my time slider. So this is a moment in time from the beginning of my animation to the end of my animation. And the y-axis is always going to be the value of that attribute. So they mean different things, of course, depending on the attribute. Sometimes it's your translation. So Translate Z, you can see it's going from, and you can see these numbers over here, right? I set my Translate Z value to 0 at frame 1 and 10 to frame 24. And you can see that value is correct here, right? So at frame 1, it's at 0. And at frame 24, it's at a value of 10, right? And this is just showing how quickly it's changing from one attribute to the next, right? You can see on all these other ones, because I'm not changing any of them, none of their values are changing, right? So they're constant, right? So it's the rotate Z value is 0 at frame 1 and 0 at frame 24. If I came in here and then let's say I wanted to rotate it like 360 degrees and set a keyframe, right? You can do, so the hotkeys inside of, jumping around, the hotkeys inside of a graph editor is A or F so A is going to show everything, and then it's going to like kind of rescale your graph to fit, right? So now before we were like focused on like translate Y, or translate Z, sorry. And so it didn't have the right values to it. And so it was like from 0 to 10, but we're going up to like 360. So when I pressed F or A, it essentially frames the whole thing in the right scale. So F and A is just going to frame your graph in a nice way. So you can see here, now that I've added a rotation value here, at frame 24, it goes up to 360, right? Okay, so I'll just delete that. And you can manipulate the, so where before, let's go ahead and go to Translate Z, right? Where before, like in the time slider, we can't use a lot of our hotkeys that we can in the 3D view, and here we can. So I can actually select this. Like if I go in here and let's say I select my object and I want to delete this keyframe, I can't press backspace because it deletes my object in the 3D view, right? But I can delete my keyframes in the graph editor. So I can select the keyframes, and there are these little diamonds. And if I press delete, you'll see it actually deletes the keyframe instead of the object. So that's another nice benefit of the graph editor is you can do a lot of the same things you could do in the 3D view. Okay, so let's go ahead and we're going to focus on Translate Z. So this is a pretty important component to this. So these both have the exact same curve to them. And what they have is, these are called tangents. Sorry, it's a little, I'm not very good at teaching animation in a very easy, comprehensive way. But each of these points is affecting this curve that is happening over time, right? So it's this rate of change, this curve is representing the how fast and how slow it's going at certain times, right? Let me go ahead and see if I can scale this. Oops, no, not that, sorry. Trying to remember what the hotkey is. There it is, okay. Right, so I'm going to exaggerate this a little bit. So this is like you think of it as like a slope, right? Like a hill that you're rolling a ball down. And instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have this go in the opposite direction. So yeah, so we're just going to grab these values and I'm going to move them down here instead. Okay, so they're going the opposite direction and we're going to get them to -10. All right. I just wanted them to go the other way just because this is easier to look at. So we have translate Z. So you can think of it like a ball rolling down a hill, right? If you pushed a ball, right, it would, or you set a ball right here on the slope, what it'd do is it'd gradually pick up momentum, right? And at this part of the slope, it'd be going the fastest, right? You'd expect right here, this is where it's going as quick as possible. And then as the hill starts to flatten out, the ball slowly rolls to a stop, right? And so this is kind of how I think I originally kind of grasped the idea of the graph editor, is that it's these shapes of these curves is really how quickly or how slowly something is changing over time. And so with the translate Z, it's obviously how quickly it's moving forward in space, right? And so right here, when the slope right here is flat or less steep, then, and let me go ahead and do that, see if I can get this, there we go. Right, I'm exaggerate it, right? So you can see between frames 1 to 6, it moves -1, right? So that's 5 frames. So if I go over to between frames 6 to 11, right, it moved 2 spaces, right? So it's actually going twice as fast in the same period of time. And so you can look at this where it's not changing the distance or the value that much between these frames because this slope is really flat, right? But as soon as we get to here, our slope is really, really fast, right? And so our object is going to be moving quicker through space. Then as we get to the end, the rate of change slows down again because that slope is getting flat again. So I hope that kind of makes sense. I do think this is one of those things where some people, or sometimes it can be really hard to wrap your head around or start thinking about it in this particular way. Certain attributes, it makes a lot of sense. Certain attributes, you'll be like kind of having to sit and think about it and be like, how does this curve affect that? So anyways, so that's why we're getting, and if you notice when you play this back, it might not be as noticeable. Let me go ahead and I'm going to move this value to here. Oh, wait, no. Let's move, shoot. Oh, no, let's have it happen faster, sorry. So I'm just going to grab this keyframe, and I'm just going to move it so it happens maybe half the time. It's kind of hard to tell, but generally speaking, it's going to start off a little slow, go faster, and then slow down as it eases in, right? So you can see in these two frames right here, it's very slow. These ones, it's moving a very big distance, and then right here, it's very slow again. All right. So these are the default. These are what's called auto tangents, and so each of these keyframes has these little handles to them, which are called tangent handles, right? And so they're essentially adjusting the rate of change of that curve, right? If that curve is, like going really, really quickly or going really, really slowly, if it has an ease in and ease out, or if it's constant. So an auto tangent is going to give you this kind of like nice little S shape that it's always going to have. And so this is what these buttons are right here. If you hover over these little buttons right here, they're going to set the tangents for your keyframe. So by default, everything's set to auto tangent. Okay. If I set this to linear, so I'm going to grab, that's why I have 2 balls. I'm going to select 1 ball, and I'm going to go ahead and set this to linear. And we'll take a look at how this affects things. So I'll click on linear. You'll see we don't have that ease in and speed up and then ease out. We have just a constant rate of change, right? And so it has a constant speed and it has no acceleration or deceleration. And so when I play that back, right, that top one is just always going at the same speed. And you can see that bottom one is kind of speeding up, going fast, and then slowing down, right? So this is, and let me go ahead and see if I can drag these to happen over a slightly longer period of time. We'll just set this, go ahead and drag this out. And we'll just drag this over to here. Okay, so I'll play that back. Right, so the top one is just moving at a very, very constant speed. The bottom one is easing in, easing out. Okay, I can actually select that bottom one, right? And we can accentuate this a little bit better, right? So, or a little bit more. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna drag or move this handle and just kind of shift those endpoints a little bit. And actually, I don't know if this is gonna work very well, but with how far away these are. I'll do something really quick that usually you don't wanna do, but I'm going to go ahead and tangents. Let's see, free tangent length, tangents. Oh, shoot, sorry. It's weighted tangents, okay. Don't worry about what I'm doing right here because you won't have to do this, but I just want a free tangent length. Right, so I'm gonna exaggerate this a little bit. I'll select this, curves, weighted tangents, free tangent length, okay. I think I didn't do it. Oh, there it goes, okay. All right, so I'm like exaggerating that speed up and slow down, but we'll see how that looks. So you can see it starts really, really slow, speeds up really quickly, and then slows down to a halt. And they more or less, again, get to the same spot at the same time, right? Anyway, so I just wanted to bring this up because this is really important for learning or understanding like how these curves affect the quality of your motion. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and delete these keyframes for a second. I'm going to delete the second ball. We're going to bring this down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set this keyframe here. I'm going to move it over, set a keyframe here, oops, at like frame, let's say 24. And then I'm going to, in between, at frame about 12 or 13, I'm going to go ahead and set a keyframe here. Yeah, I'm not sure why it's not moving. Oh, I didn't. Yeah, I must have just lost that first. Thank you. So, okay, so I just go ahead and set these. I press F to frame this. I'm going to go ahead and go to frame 12, pull this up, set a keyframe, and we're just going to focus on that translate Y, right? So we can see our ball moves up like that, goes down. So with a few more advanced keyframes here, or a few more pieces here, and I'm realizing this is definitely going to have to be another video that I record. I always think this is going to go really quickly in class. I just wanted to show this to you guys with some other keyframes. And actually, let me go ahead and I'm going to drag this one forward a little bit. And I'm just going to copy this one, copy. I'm going to put this one right here, paste. Yeah. So I'm going to grab all these guys and let's see if I drag this closer. Okay, that's fine. And I'll set all of these guys to auto tangent. Okay, and then so auto tangent is pretty similar to, it has some quirks to it, but it's pretty similar to the spline tangent where, and I say that and you can see the spline tangent's way different, but it's a spline tangent or a spline curve is essentially going to have this S shape to it. I think what auto tangents is doing is, I'm going to set these all to spline for a second. And so even though you can see, even though these frames right here are the exact same, right? You can see it's kind of doing this little overshoot on top of it. And so I'm just trying to show you guys and go through each of these a little bit. If we do a plateau or flat, not clamped, flat tangents, what it's going to do is it's going to flatten it out. And that's something that you saw with the auto tangents, right? So auto tangents is like a spline mixed with a plateau. But anyways, okay, so a flat tangent is essentially going to, or maybe it's all plateau or flat tangents. Maybe auto is just flat tangents everywhere. I don't know. So we have our flat tangents, which are going to essentially flatten out the handles on either side. Spline is going to try to point along the curve, right? And so we're getting this specific shape. Linear is going to be trying to make each of those sides as flat as possible and not have any curvature to it. And we don't have to do it on all of it, right? So all of it, like maybe the endpoints over here can have ease in and ease out, but these ones right here can be linear, right? So on this side of this curve, it's flat or straight. and there's no curvature to it, but on this side it does have curvature to it. So we will frequently mix and match, depending on the situation, our tangents. And so we have the spline, which is going to turn those curve handles towards the shape, and usually gives you like an S shape to your curve. You have your, I'm not going to worry about clamps right now, your flat tangents. So let's do spline, flat tangents, which is going to flatten out the shape. We have our linear tangents, which are going to essentially try to eliminate the curve. And we also have this other one called stepped tangents, and right here. And what stepped tangents is it's going to keep the previous keyframe's value all the way up to the next keyframe. And so you guys might be thinking to yourself, like, why would I ever use that? And it's really very dependent on certain situations. Like you want to make something kind of robotic, but a lot of times people will use this when they do like a rough breakout of their animation and they don't want to have to deal with the fact that they have to clean up their tangents, because your tangents might actually add a lot of extra motion that you weren't intending. And so to clean it up, you can kind of ignore, or you can use step tangents to kind of ignore the, let's go ahead and grab everything. So I can select all of these, and I'm going to just go to steps tangents. And so if I do this, it's just going to be boop, boop, like kind of like a 16-bit video or 8-bit video game or something like that. And so it's just like essentially 3 keyframes over time. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and set these back to auto. All right, so let's get, oh gosh. All right, well, I don't even know if we have time to get started in the bouncing ball animation. So I guess I'm gonna have to record another video. Let me see if there's anything else I want to cover while we're here. So let me go ahead and I'm going to go back to that translate Y. So a lot of times, let's go ahead and let's do one of the first things that we do in the bouncing ball animation. How about that? So I'm just going to go ahead and grab all my keyframes by selecting my sphere in this space. If also sometimes, depending on your setup, you might select a different object and it doesn't select that new object and populate in the graph editor. And there's this little button right here. This is like your auto load graph editor. So just make sure that's on, and that's just going to, whatever you have selected, it's going to show it. But I'm going to come in here. I'm going to go that. I'm just going to delete all these keyframes after the first keyframe. And I'm just going to make sure I have all these keyframes. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and have this. Actually, let's start it from the up here. We're going to drop it from a height and have it bounce once. Okay. So we're going to have key selected. We are going to go to, I don't know why it does that sometimes. There's something I'm missing. Oh, maybe there's, let me just delete these keyframes. Maybe I wasn't selecting translate Y. Okay, whatever. So I'll go ahead and set this up higher, set key, and we'll go. Okay, cool. All right. So I'll go over to frame 10. And it's going to drop down to the ground. Set a keyframe. Go this one. Let's go ahead and set this to a whole number just because it'll be easy to remember. And then I'm going to go to frame 20 and set this back to, I think it was 8. It was either 9 or 8. Yeah, 9. Okay. All right, I'll press F to kind of frame this all. So, and let's go ahead and set this, the endpoint to this to 20, right? So this is going to loop, right? Because as soon as it's done, it's going to loop back to the beginning. So when I play this, right? So if you look at this as a bouncing ball animation, let's say, there's a lot of this that's by default, like we got the main poses correct, but this is where we're going to be able to use our playing around with our tangents to shape the action in a believable and also appealing way, right? So what's happening is, we'll go to translate Y. We have these auto tangents, which is, adding in this acceleration and deceleration into our curve, right? So you can see it starts off, and again, this is going up and down, right? This value represents going up and down over time. So, it starts falling slowly, which might be believable, right? Or I guess in this case, it is believable. Pretend it's like someone drops the ball, right? But when we're dropping something or we're worrying about height on Earth, things moving up and down, we're primarily working with the force of gravity. So there's always a downward acceleration. So when we drop a ball, it makes sense that it will start to pick up speed, right? But what doesn't make sense is that and let's go ahead and let's move it so it just touches the bottom on the floor right there. And I'll just go ahead and right click the key selected. There we go. So what happens, you'll start to notice, is that it actually slows down right before it hits the ground. And that doesn't make sense because if you drop a ball, it can't, well, for one, it can't like physically in air like slow itself down, but it also gives the impression that the ball knows it's about to hit the ground, which doesn't make much sense, right? If you drop something, it's going to keep accelerating to the essentially into the earth until it hits a hard surface, right? So it's always going to build up acceleration. So this auto tangent that's happening right here is a problem, right? Because it's adding in this ease out or this deacceleration, which means that it's slowing down its downward momentum. So what we can do is we can select this keyframe and we can set this to linear tangents. And what that's going to do is it's going to make that rate of change constant all the way up to, or it's not going to have any deacceleration, right? It's going to keep its previous speed before the keyframe until it gets to it and then immediately change to the opposite direction. So now when I play it back, it's not quite there yet still. And I don't know why it's slightly higher. Must have messed something up. Oh, never mind. It was a playback. It's like dropping frames. So on y'all's side, also at home, it probably looks like it's like 2 frames. Even on my computer, it's kind of choppy. But what's happening is now instead it's not slowing down before it hits the ground, and it hits the surface and pops back up with essentially the same speed. But then it slows down as it goes up, right? Because as it's moving upwards, it has a velocity going up. But again, gravity is pulling it back down. So it kind of slows to a stop until it hits a stop, and then it starts picking up speed back in the other direction, right? And what we can do is we can actually come in here, and I want to make this, like right now, what it actually does is it speeds up and then it hits a constant speed, right? Which again, doesn't make much sense. It should keep speeding up, speeding up, speeding up until it hits the ground, right? And so what I want to do is I actually want to punch this first part a little bit better, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click and drag this. And so it's actually going to, again, keep getting faster until it hits the ground, right? So it's slow, picks up speed, and it's just getting faster and faster. Problem is, by dragging that handle, and we can just use the move tool. Sorry, I didn't mention that before. We can just click and drag on the handle and use the move tool to change the shape of the curve with that handle. And I'm just using the move tool right there. But the problem is, when I change this one, it's going to change the other one as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to use what's called, they're locked together. We're going to use what's called breaking the tangents. And you just select the keyframe or select either handle. We're coming here, and there's actually hotkeys right here. There's unify, which means that they're stuck together. And if I come in here, select that keyframe and click on this button right here, which says break tangents, you'll see they get a little dotted line on them, right? Which means that now I can drag one without affecting the other one, right? So I can click and drag that up, and I can click and drag this one up on the other side. And so this is going to make it so that it's going to keep picking up speed until it hits the ground, and then it's going to pop up with essentially the same amount of speed and slow down as it deaccelerates due to gravity. So now when I play this back, right, that starts to feel a little bit more believable, right? Where it's it really punches the wall and snaps back up instead of like slowing down, touching the wall, then speeding back up to get up into the sky, right? And again, it doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense earlier for it to, let's go to translate Y. Let's select this. We'll do auto tangents. It doesn't make sense that, again, similarly like it's slowing down before it hits the ground, it doesn't make sense that it actually starts from like a rest and starts to pick up acceleration as it goes up, because it has no external, locomotive source that is like adding energy to it and forcing it up in the air. It'd be different if, like what this animation right here feels like, and I know we're running over, but let me go ahead and copy this for a second. So I'm just going to go keyframe, keyframe, and then at frame 10, we're just, keyframe, frame 1 to 20. Let's go ahead and drag this up and keyframe it, right? So the one on the left is going to be, and then drag that up to 10 or 9 or whatever this is. 9. And keyframe, this one's 9, keyframe. Oop. 9, keyframe. Okay. All right. So I'm going to do on the one on the right, we're just going to do that. Or actually on the one on the left, we'll do that break. So we'll just select these, select this, select these to linear so that we get rid of the curve on this keyframe, and we'll just click and drag that up. Right. And so now when we play these next to each other, and let's really quickly, I'm going to get rid of the translate Z, just so I can move it over. We'll move them right next to each other. There we go. And at frame 10, I want this to be on the ground. Okay. I'll let it play. Right. So the one on the left feels like gravity is affecting it. The one on the right feels like I have my hand here and I'm like kind of holding it and kind of, moving it up and down, because if I was using my hand with it, right, my hand would having to be slow down. Like imagine on the right-hand side, we have like a hand holding this, right? That arm to like slow it down to move it back up would have to kind of, I'm like using my own body to deaccelerate my arm movement, and then I'm using my own body to reaccelerate it upwards again, right? So the one on the right kind of feels like something is holding it or controlling it because it's deaccelerating, reaccelerating, pulling it up and down. Whereas the one on the left feels like it is being affected by gravity and not being controlled by anything outside of gravity because, it's not having that slowdown effect.